Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Gene Curl for those of you who are new. And this is, I believe, the 8th part of a multi-part series on my deconversion. Is it possible that I could have told my entire story in one video? Probably not, because there's a lot involved with it and because I'm long-winded and I like to hear myself talk. So this is I believe, the 8th part in the series. If you missed the rest of it, if you missed the rest of it, you might want to go back and watch it because there's a lot that you have missed so far. But just a brief synopsis, like a 100-mile overview. I was raised in a Christian cult. I left that Christian cult. I joined Mormonism. I went on a mission. I had started having some doubts. Came home from a mission, went to college, had more doubts, and then that was pretty much the 100-mile overview where we're at right now. There's obviously a whole lot more to it, so you'd benefit you to watch the rest of the videos if you haven't already. This video, I'm mostly going to be talking about my time in the U.S. Navy, which was short-lived due to the fact that I got caught sleepwalking. Basically, I had been engaged for quite a while, and I realized that she didn't love me the way I loved her, and I realized that she was never going to take a stand for herself, that she was going to let her parents control her life, and therefore we would never have a happy life together. And we broke up, or I broke up with her. And to this day, breaking up with my fiance is the hardest thing that I've ever had to do. And after I had broken up with her, as I mentioned in the last video, I went and tried to go to California and Social Security systems, but I wound up working for some people who were extremely dishonest, and that didn't work out. So I came back. Well, I still really wanted to get away from southern Idaho. I wanted to get out of the area, thought that maybe I could run from my problems. And so I thought, well, I will join the military. And after talking to the different branches, I decided that the Navy would be the best bet because they offered me more money. After I joined the Navy, I immediately knew that I had made a mistake, but I decided to make the best of things. The Navy wasn't exactly the best choice for me. I think I would have been better off had I joined the Air Force, but, decisions were made. In my division, I was the only one who cared about religion at all, so they made me the religious petty officer, which basically meant that I would lead the prayer in the evenings, and that I got the chance to go to more religious services because of that position. However, even though I was supposed to go to these religious services and talk to the chaplain, I was prohibited from talking to the chaplain or going to these services because it was part of my punishment for not being able to march. See, when I was in the Navy, normally in my life, I've been pretty good at things. But when I was in the Navy, it was the first time that I really sucked at everything. I couldn't stay in step in marching to save my life. I wasn't really any good at any of the Navy things, except for the books. The book stuff I was really good at. I aced the ASVAB test before I joined the Navy, which is supposed to be really hard, and I was told that I could do anything in the Navy I wanted except for Special Forces because I was too small. And I decided I wanted to be an information specialist because that meant that I wouldn't get shot at and I wouldn't have to shoot at anybody else. And so that was my choice when I went in. But pretty much anything in the Navy that I was supposed to do, the marching, the drills, everything, I really sucked at them. And I did my absolute best, but I just couldn't do it right. Because of things like not being able to march properly, I was always in trouble. whenever we'd be marching, if anybody would fall down or we'd get out of step, they'd immediately assume it was my fault, which it always was, and they would always yell, "Curl!" And so I couldn't march to save my life. There was at one point I had an interview with a doctor because I wasn't feeling well, and in the interview with the doctor, I mentioned to the doctor that I had been caught sleepwalking. Well, what happened is in the middle of the night, one of the other guys in my division, he caught me trying to brush my teeth with my razor. I was there putting toothpaste on my razor, and he asked me what I was doing. I said I was going to brush my teeth, and he realized I wasn't awake, so he woke me up. And of course, at that point, I went back to bed. But they caught me sleepwalking a couple of times, and sleepwalking is an immediate disqualification for the Navy. I didn't know that at the time. When I was joining the Navy, the recruiter asked me if I'd been sleepwalking past the age of 12, and I said I wasn't sure. So he said, "Well, let's just say no, that you haven't, unless you're absolutely certain that you have." And so he just put, "No, I haven't been sleepwalking." And well, turns out I was sleepwalking. I just hadn't had anybody watching me while I slept. When I talked to the doctor because I was sick, I mentioned the fact that I was sleepwalking, and then they put that on my card, and then they said that they're going to have somebody do a sleep study. Well, the chief of my division, she called me into her office, and she said, "Curl, you are undoubtedly the smartest motherfucker that I have ever known in my life. But to be so smart, you do some of the dumbest shit." Which is true. On paper, I was really smart, but I did a whole lot of really dumb things. I don't really know why. Being smart doesn't prevent you from making poor choices. But I think it was the stress of the Navy that caused me to sleepwalk. The whole time I was in the Navy, everybody's supposed to get a phone call home when they first get there. I wasn't given a phone call home for some reason. And then when it came time for the second and third phone calls, I wasn't allowed the phone call. And the reason I wasn't is because there was one thing that I hadn't done that they wanted me to do, which was when you first get in the Navy, you have to do a swim test, which involves jumping off of a high platform into this Olympic-sized pool, swimming to the other side. That I did. I did that without any problems. I'm not a great swimmer, but I can swim. So I jumped off platform, swam to the other side. The part of the thing that I couldn't do is there's this part where you have to float on your face for 5 minutes. And that always freaked me out, having my face in the water, because when I was a kid, my father tried to drown me. There's this incident where we went out to this lake, and it was cold in wintertime, and I saw this board. As we pulled into this lake, I saw this piece of a 2x4 sitting by the side of the water. And as soon as we got out, I picked it up and threw it in the water, and I was throwing rocks at it, pretending it was a ship and there was a plane trying to bomb it. My father came over and smacked me on the back of the head and told me that he wanted that 2x4 and I had to go out and get it. So I tried to reach it with a stick, but the wind had already blown it too far out. I couldn't reach it. So my father made me wade out to go get it, knowing that I couldn't swim. When the water was up to my nose, I begged my father, or actually when the water was up to my chin, I begged my father to let me come back, but he wouldn't. He told me that if I didn't get that 2x4, he'd beat me so hard I couldn't sit down for a month. Well, I realized that it was too far out. There's no way I could get it. I couldn't swim. And I decided that I would rather be beaten than freeze to death or drown. So I came back to shore. As soon as I came back to shore, my father hit me so hard he knocked me over. Then he picked me up by my belt, and he carried me like a suitcase. And he carried me out to the end of this boat dock, and he threw me off into the water. Threw me at this 2x4. Well, he was a pretty good aim because my forehead hit this 2x4 and it cut a gash in my forehead. So I was bleeding, I was cold, I was scared, and I didn't know how to swim. So I was treading water, trying not to drown, and I managed to make it back to the dock. And I thought my father was going to reach down and pull me up on the dock, but instead he put his foot on my forehead and he kicked me off the dock. And then he turned around and walked off. Well, I made it to the dock the second time. I climbed up, and I think I threw up everything that I had pretty much ever eaten. And then I ran back. Ran back to our camper. I was cold and shivering, and then I got whipped for lying about my father, because when I said that he threw me off in the water, he said he didn't. He told my mother that I fell in the water and that he saved me after I was told not to get by the water. So I had a lot of PTSD about that, and having my face in the water caused that to come up. And that made it so that I was having an extremely difficult time doing this prone test. And I kept failing this prone test because I kept rolling over on my back, or I'd swim or something. I just couldn't just float on my face. And yes, so because I hadn't passed this prone test, they were taken out. They were trying to retaliate against me because of it, and that's why they didn't allow me to have any phone calls. Now, I did not know this at the time, but the time I joined the Navy, I was having a manic episode. I did not yet know that I was bipolar, but I was having a manic episode. I was on top of the world when I joined the Navy. It seemed like the greatest idea in the world. I didn't put a whole lot of thought in it. I just did it. But I wasn't, and so from the time that I decided to join the Navy, I joined the Navy. I did everything I could to get in shape, to pass all the physical tests, and I felt great. Well, I wasn't in the Navy long before I went into deep depression, and I just felt that I couldn't do anything right, especially since I was told I couldn't do anything right. I felt like I was a complete failure. I was letting my family down. I was letting the government down. And while I was in the Navy, they'd let us go to church, and they had an LDS service on base, but at the time, the way it was being conducted, I felt more at home at the non-denominational service, and so a lot of times I went to the non-denominational service instead of the LDS service. I did actually go to the LDS service quite a bit, and I prayed and I read my scriptures, and I prayed daily, read my scripture daily, and I was being in the Navy and being in that high stress environment. It caused me to cling to my faith. I think if I hadn't joined the Navy, I would have lost my faith sooner. But being in the Navy, it caused me I had to have something to keep me grounded, something to give me hope. And having faith gave me that hope. It gave me something to cling on to. And so while I was in the Navy going through this, even though I still struggled with doubts, I was really clinging on to my faith. At the same time, I kept worrying and praying that because I was afraid that my sleepwalking would get me discharged, and I was afraid that not being able to pass the prone float test would get me discharged. And so I was praying, and I was begging God to help me out, help me to not have so much PTSD. I was praying to God to let me pass this prone test so that I could stay in the Navy, and that I would be able to pass the sleep test so that I would also be able to stay in. But there was one day after I failed the prone test, I was just so depressed. I felt like I had let my family down. I felt like I'd let God down. I felt like I'd let the church down. I felt like I'd let the Navy down. I felt like I just couldn't do anything right. I just knew I was going to get discharged, and I just couldn't stand the thought. And so I had this pin on my chest that was to represent the fact that I was the religious PO in my division. So that was the only sharp thing I had, and so I took it and I slit my wrist with it. But it didn't cut very well because it was kind of dull, and so there wasn't much blood. But somebody caught me doing that, and they were yelling at me, "Hey, what are you doing?" And so I just took off. When I came back to my division, I didn't want my chief to know that I was home yet. Not home, well, yeah, home, I guess. Anyway, I didn't want my chief to know that I was back to the division yet. So I sat in the bathroom and I wrote her a letter because I just couldn't get myself to actually talk to her, but I knew I needed help. I knew that if I didn't have help, I would attempt suicide again. And I was scared by the fact that I did attempt suicide. So I wrote a letter to my chief and I gave it to somebody else to give to her. She called me to her and she's like, "Carl, did you write this letter?" And I said, "Yeah, I wrote it." And she's like, "Well, why didn't you just tell me what you wanted to tell me?" And I told her, I said, "Well, if you read the letter, it'll become clear." So she sent me away. She read the letter. And then she called me back. She asked me to show her my wrist, which I did. And she was, at that point, nice to me for the first time ever. Since the entire time I'd been in her division, she was extremely mean to me. When she realized that I was struggling, she was nice to me for the first time. And she said, "Carl, don't worry, we're going to get you help." And I said, "Does that mean I'm going to have to leave the division?" She said, "Yes, it does." And I didn't know exactly what getting help would entail. But then an ambulance pulled up. The petty officers, they told me to gather up my few of my items. And I was taken in an ambulance to the emergency room on base. While I was at the emergency room, they decided to take my blood and all those other things that they normally do. But the nurse, he was new, I guess. So he stuck the thing in my arm to take the blood, but then he didn't put the vial on it. And then blood was just spurting everywhere. And another nurse walked by and she saw blood spurting everywhere. And she's like, "Oh my God." And she ran in and first thought that I had done it to myself because, I was there for a suicide attempt. So she realized what was going on. So she put a vial in to collect my blood and did it properly. And then she went out into the hallway and ripped this other nurse a new one. And then when the doctor came in, the doctor was asking me all about my life, asking me about all kinds of stuff. Reading the paperback that the doctor wrote, reading the notes back that the doctor wrote, I can tell that she didn't actually pay any attention at all to what I said. But she'd asked me, she said, "Do you want to stay in the Navy?" And I said, "Yes, but do I have a choice?" And she said, "No, you don't have a choice." And I said, "Then why are you asking me?" And she said, "Because I just want to know what you say." And I said, "Well, am I going to be able to stay in the Navy?" And she laughed and she said, "No, I'm going to recommend that you're separated from the Navy." And then after we talked a little bit, she told me that she was going to commit me. And that remains to this day the scariest moment of my life because I had no idea what that would entail. I knew that being committed would for sure end my Navy career. I knew that I would wind up being discharged and sent home. I had absolutely no idea what it would be like to be in a mental hospital or anything, but she told me I was going to be committed, and I was pretty scared about that. So after they finished up with me, then they had a police officer come by, and I rode in a cop car from the emergency room to the mental wing of the hospital. They didn't handcuff me or anything. They just had me ride in the back of this cop car. And they took me in, and shortly after I made it into this mental hospital, they took my shoestrings, they took my belt, they had somebody watch me sleep. They wouldn't let me shave. wouldn't let me have a shower curtain. I had to shower without a shower curtain because they were afraid I would try to strangle myself. And it was pretty humiliating. After I was in there a day or so, they had me talk to a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist diagnosed me with bipolar disorder type 1. They put me on lithium and told me that I would have to take meds the rest of my life. And that thought scared me as well. I didn't know what else what to think about this. This whole time, though, in this hospital, I was thinking, I felt like God had abandoned me. Like no matter how much I prayed, I didn't feel God's presence. And I really felt like God had abandoned me. Eventually, the missionaries came by to visit me. I don't think they came on their own, actually. The bishop sent them. I don't know why the bishop didn't come, but anyhow, the missionaries came by to visit me, but they only came by to see me once. And didn't matter how much I prayed, didn't matter how sincere I was, didn't matter how much I read my scriptures. I didn't feel like God was there. I felt like God had abandoned me, and I couldn't understand why God would leave me. After it got to the point where I was deemed that I wouldn't be a danger to myself anymore, they discharged me from the Navy, and I was given a one-way bus ticket home. Now, before this point, I had talked to my parents on the phone and told them, hey, don't come to my graduation because I'm not going to be graduating basic because of this. And I told them what had happened, but I told them not to tell anybody. Of course, my mother decided that she wanted to have everybody pray for me. So she told a lot of people about what had happened so that they could pray for me. And I was extremely livid about that. So when I came home from the Navy, I didn't stay with my mother. I stayed with my sister. It took a little while for me to work things out with my mother because I just felt like I felt like my trust had been violated for her to tell everybody. I mean, at this point, I don't care if people knew. But at that point, it seemed so shameful to me to have anybody know that I was in a mental hospital. It seemed so shameful to me to have anyone know that I had attempted suicide. It seemed so shameful to me to have anybody know that I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And I just didn't want anybody to know. And the fact that my mother told everybody was the biggest violation of trust, in my opinion. But we've made up and we're good now. But after I got home from the Navy, I started going to church again. I didn't always go to church, but I started going to church at least part of the time. I still had serious doubts, and I was trying to overcome those doubts. But I still had some serious doubts. I was at the point where I did not believe the church was true, but I desperately wanted to believe it was true. I felt like I needed to believe it was true, and I was still trying to convince myself that it was true. And this was about the point where I met my ex-wife. And I will talk about that in the next video. But I'll just say that at this point, I was only partially active, and I didn't always follow the word of wisdom. I sometimes would drink tea. I didn't drink coffee even though I wanted to because I felt like drinking coffee was a bigger violation of the word of wisdom. I don't know why I thought that, but I did. I guess thinking that if I had started drinking coffee that I was completely giving up on the church, and I wasn't ready for that. So anyhow, I think that's a good place to cut the story for now. In the next video, I will talk about my marriage to my ex-wife and some doubts that I had at that point, and when I eventually left the church. So Hopefully you stay around for that part of the story. If you haven't done so already, I would greatly appreciate it if you would subscribe to my channel. Click the bell icon so you'll be notified when I post new videos. If this video series will help anyone that you know, I would appreciate it if you would share it with them. And if you feel the need to comment, please just be nice. And with that, I will catch you in the next video.